By late July 1944, the Allied invasion of France had succeeded in the narrowest, least satisfying way possible. The beaches were secure, the lodgment held, and an enormous flow of men, vehicles, and supplies was pouring into Normandy every single day. On paper, everything looked stable, almost reassuring. On the ground, nothing moved. Normandy had become a trap built out of success. The terrain did most of the damage. The bocage countryside broke the battlefield into countless enclosed spaces, each one bordered by thick hedgerows that turned simple advances into close-range fights. Tanks struggled to maneuver without exposing themselves. Infantry could rarely see beyond the next field, and artillery support often lagged behind the pace of contact. Progress came one field at a time, paid for in blood, exhaustion, and time that could not be recovered. Doctrine made it worse. Allied planning assumed momentum would return once enough combat power had accumulated ashore, and by mid-July, that threshold had been crossed decisively. The men were there, the equipment was there, and the supplies were stacked high. What never arrived was movement. Every attack ran into prepared German defenses that absorbed pressure without collapsing. Counterattacks were beaten back, yet the front barely shifted. The battlefield consumed resources without converting them into progress. German commanders understood exactly what this meant. They could not defeat the invasion outright, but they did not need to. Holding the Allies in Normandy long enough would allow Germany to shift forces, rebuild defenses, and shape the next phase of the war on more favorable terms. Panzer divisions waited behind the line, infantry anchored the hedgerows, and the entire defensive system was designed to punish any attempt at rapid advance. Time favored the defender. By mid-July, Allied leadership faced an uncomfortable truth. Victory was likely, but it was moving far too slowly, and every stalled week strengthened the enemy's position elsewhere. Pushing harder along the same front offered no solution. Something had to give, and it had to give violently enough to break the pattern. That pressure release was named Operation Cobra. Cobra was not designed as another incremental push. It aimed to tear a hole in the German front so wide and chaotic that cohesion itself would collapse. Instead of spreading force across the line, Allied planners concentrated overwhelming air power into a narrow sector west of St. Lo, betting that shock would achieve what steady pressure could not. When the bombing began on July 25, 1944, the effect was devastating. Thousands of aircraft struck German positions in a matter of hours, burying units, shattering communications, and turning organized defenses into wreckage. Roads vanished under craters, command posts ceased functioning, and survivors struggled to understand where the front even existed anymore. For the first time since D-Day, the German line did not bend. It broke shape. That rupture alone meant nothing unless someone could exploit it. History offered countless examples of successful breaches that led nowhere, where confusion faded just long enough for defenders to recover and seal the gap. German doctrine was built around exactly that response, using reserves and counterattacks to restore order before chaos spread. Exploitation required speed, nerve, and a willingness to move into uncertainty before the enemy could regroup. That army already existed, held deliberately out of the Normandy fighting, waiting behind the lines, sat the force built for this moment. Officially, the delay was operational. Unofficially, it was political. The army belonged to George S. Patton, a commander whose ability to generate momentum came paired with a reputation for creating friction at every level of command. Patton had not been sidelined because his competence was doubted. He had been held back because unleashing him too early carried risks Allied leadership was unwilling to take. After July 25th, the risk shifted decisively. Leaving that army unused became more dangerous than releasing it. The Third Army Patton commanded had been assembled with a specific purpose in mind. Its staff was trained for movement rather than control, its commanders were accustomed to acting on intent rather than instruction, and its logistical planners understood that supply existed to enable motion, not to perfect it. Above all, its commander believed hesitation helped the enemy more reliably than mistakes ever could. Once the bombing lifted and ground forces began pushing through the shattered German sector, Patton was activated with orders that were simple and dangerous. Exploit success, move fast, and do not wait for the front to stabilize. Disorder was not a problem to solve, it was an opportunity to expand. The conditions favored him immediately. German units inside the breach were disoriented, fragmented, and cut off from reliable command. Reserves were mispositioned, roads beyond the front lay open, and the terrain past Normandy favored maneuver rather than defense. For the first time since the invasion, space replaced congestion. Patton did not wait for clarity. As soon as passages were secured, Third Army units surged forward in multiple directions at once, flowing through the gap rather than punching down a single axis. Columns advanced laterally and forward at the same time, probing for weak points, bypassing resistance, and refusing to be fixed in place. German units that resisted were pushed aside, isolated, or ignored entirely. The objective was not to fight the enemy where he stood, but to force him to react everywhere at once. This approach unsettled both sides. German commanders struggled to identify the main effort because it kept shifting, and every American column looked dangerous. American forces appeared in rear areas faster than defenses could be reoriented, and roads meant for movement turned into escape routes for retreating units. The German defensive system, built to absorb pressure from a defined front, began to unravel once that front ceased to exist. Allied commanders watched with equal parts admiration and concern. Maps changed faster than staff officers could update them. Units advanced beyond planned boundaries within hours, and coordination lagged behind movement. To Patton, this confusion was confirmation. The enemy no longer dictated tempo. Fuel replaced firepower as the immediate limit. Tank columns advanced until they ran dry, halted just long enough to refuel, then pushed again. Supply convoys worked continuously, and decisions were made to prioritize movement over balance, allowing some units to surge while others waited. These imbalances worried planners, but they preserved momentum, which Patton viewed as the only true protection against counterattack. German reactions followed a familiar pattern and failed for the same reasons. Attempts to form new defensive lines came too late. Counterattacks were launched with inadequate coordination, and units arrived piecemeal into situations that no longer mattered. The faster Third Army moved, the more fragmented German responses became. Within days, the character of the war in France changed completely. What had been a rigid front turned into a fluid struggle across open terrain, where control depended on circulation rather than position. Roads, fuel, and decision speed mattered more than prepared defenses. This was not improvisation born of chaos. It was the application of a method rehearsed earlier under harsher conditions. Sicily had taught Patton how to move faster than an enemy could organize. France gave him the space to apply that lesson on a continental scale. By the end of the first week, the Third Army had accomplished what months of fighting in Normandy had not. German command lost the ability to impose structure on the battlefield, and the front dissolved into motion. The war was no longer about breaking out. It was about how far speed could carry before new limits appeared. That question would define everything that followed. The collapse that followed Operation Cobra did not resemble the breakthroughs commanders rehearsed on maps. There were no clean edges, no stable flanks, no orderly transition from attack to exploitation. What unfolded instead was something far more dangerous and far more decisive. The German front did not retreat. It dissolved. Across western France, the battlefield stopped behaving like a line and started behaving like open space. As Third Army units pushed through the shattered sector west of Saint-Lô, resistance appeared in fragments rather than formations. A roadblock here, an ambush there, a small town defended just long enough to slow traffic before being abandoned. German units still existed, still fought, and still inflicted casualties, but they no longer operated as a system. Command links were broken. Orders arrived late or not at all, and no one could say with confidence where the front actually was. This was the environment Patton had built his army to exploit. German commanders reacted exactly as doctrine demanded, which meant they tried to restore order by drawing new defensive lines deeper inland. Rivers, road junctions, and towns were marked as anchors, and reserves were rushed forward to seal what was assumed to be a temporary rupture. On paper, the logic was sound. In reality, the timing was fatal. Patton did not aim for the line. He aimed past it. Rather than driving the Third Army forward along a single thrust, he allowed it to spread across the operational depth of France. Corps advanced on divergent routes, exploiting opportunity wherever it appeared. When resistance was encountered, it was fixed briefly, then bypassed. Towns that might have required costly assaults were surrounded and left behind. German units isolated in this way did not vanish immediately, but they ceased to matter. This approach shattered German decision-making. German doctrine relied on identifying the main Allied effort and concentrating reserves to counter it. Patton denied them that clarity. Every American column looked dangerous, every road seemed threatened, and every report arriving at headquarters was already out of date. Reserves were committed in pieces, arriving too late or striking ground the Americans had already left. Inside the Third Army, this phase felt chaotic but liberating. Movement was constant, and decisions dropped rapidly down the chain of command. Battalion and company commanders operated beyond reliable contact with higher headquarters, acting on intent rather than instruction. This was not disorder born of desperation. It was the natural result of a command culture that treated waiting as the greatest risk of all. Communications lagged behind movement, but that lag worked to American advantage. German intelligence struggled even more. Reports described situations that no longer existed, units that had already moved, and threats that had shifted direction. German commanders were forced to make decisions based on a battlefield that kept changing faster than their system could track. Fuel became the new battlefield. Third Army units advanced until tanks and trucks ran dry, halted just long enough to refuel, and then surged forward again. Supply officers rerouted convoys on the fly, prioritized forward units, and accepted inefficiencies that would have been unacceptable under normal conditions. The objective was continuity of motion, not balance or elegance. On the German side, withdrawal turned into disorder. Roads clogged as units retreated simultaneously without coordination. Vehicles were abandoned when fuel ran out. Heavy equipment was destroyed or left behind. Columns broke apart under constant air attack. Officers lost control as formations dissolved into streams of exhausted men trying to escape encirclement rather than execute orders. The psychological damage compounded quickly. German soldiers accustomed to fighting along defined fronts now faced threats from unexpected directions. Rear areas no longer felt safe. Command posts were overrun. Supply depots fell intact. even when German units attempted to stand and fight. They often discovered that the situation had already shifted against them. Allied command watched this unfold with unease. The speed was undeniable, but so were the risks. Third Army's flanks were thin, sometimes non-existent. Coordination with neighboring armies lagged behind movement. The fear that German forces might regroup and strike an overextended column never disappeared. These concerns were real, and Patton acknowledged them privately. What he refused to accept was the idea that slowing down would reduce danger. In his calculation, hesitation was more dangerous than exposure. A pause would give German forces time to rebuild coherence, reposition reserves, and restore structure to the battlefield. As long as Third Army kept moving, the enemy remained reactive. Momentum itself became a form of protection. This phase exposed the limits of centralized control. No headquarters could micromanage an army moving this fast across such distances. Patton did not try. He issued clear intent, trusted subordinates to act, and accepted imperfect coordination as the price of speed. Officers who had learned this lesson earlier now proved decisive. Those who could not adapt were bypassed by events. By early August, the transformation was complete. The German front in France no longer existed in any meaningful sense. What remained were fragments of resistance, pockets of delay, and desperate attempts to establish new lines that dissolved before they could solidify. Operational initiative belonged entirely to the Allies, and within the Allied command, it belonged overwhelmingly to the Third Army. This did not mean the war was over. Supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, units outran their neighbors, and weather and terrain would soon impose limits that speed alone could not overcome. German forces, though battered, were not destroyed. They were retreating toward ground where defense would once again matter. But the decisive shift had already occurred. The war in France had changed character. It was no longer about breaking out of Normandy. It was about how far exploitation could go before friction reasserted itself. Patton had turned collapse into movement, and movement into dominance. The front had disappeared, and with it, the enemy's ability to dictate the terms of the fight. What remained was a race, not just against German recovery, but against the physical limits of speed itself. A race that would soon reach its most dangerous phase. Once the German front dissolved, Patton stopped thinking in terms of battles and began thinking in terms of circulation. Roads, fuel flow, repair capacity, traffic control, and command movement became the real terrain. Firepower still mattered, but it no longer decided outcomes by itself. Control now came from how quickly an army could move through space and deny the enemy time to recover. That shift favored the Third Army immediately. Most armies are trained to fight along lines, with defined boundaries, secured flanks, and clear distinctions between front and rear. In August 1944, none of that existed across much of France. German resistance appeared without pattern, sometimes strong, sometimes absent, often dissolving before contact was fully established. The battlefield stopped offering structure. And structure was something Patton had never relied on. This was where his method worked best. Orders issued from Third Army headquarters emphasized direction rather than destination. Advance east, expand pressure north and south, and keep moving whenever movement was possible. Units were told not to stop simply because resistance appeared, and not to fight battles that did not serve momentum. German formations that could be isolated were isolated. Those that could be bypassed were left behind to be dealt with later. The result was not chaos, it was selective engagement. German units found themselves rendered irrelevant rather than destroyed. Cut off from fuel, command, and retreat routes, they ceased to function as part of a larger force even while still armed. Surrenders followed days later. when ammunition ran out and options disappeared. The battlefield filled with German soldiers who had not been defeated in combat but had been overtaken by events. This approach pushed decision-making downward at an unprecedented rate. Battalion and company commanders frequently operated beyond reliable contact with higher headquarters, making choices based on immediate conditions and the commander's intent rather than detailed orders. This was not desperation. It was habit. Officers who hesitated were quickly bypassed by faster-moving units, while those who acted decisively gained ground and influence. Patton encouraged this relentlessly. Waiting for permission was treated as failure. Acting on imperfect information was treated as responsibility. The expectation was clear. Movement mattered more than certainty. This mindset allowed Third Army units to exploit fleeting opportunities that a more rigid force would have missed entirely. German command struggled to respond because its system demanded time. Orders had to be drafted, transmitted, confirmed, and executed through chains that assumed relative stability. Stability no longer existed. Headquarters displaced constantly, communications failed, and intelligence reports arrived describing situations that had already changed. German counterattacks were launched against targets that were no longer there, while American units moved on to new objectives. Fuel shortages began shaping both sides of the fight. Third Army armored columns advanced until their tanks ran dry, paused only long enough to refuel, and then surged forward again. Supply officers improvised constantly, rerouting convoys, prioritizing forward formations, and accepting breakdowns and inefficiencies that would have been unacceptable in a slower campaign. The objective was not perfection, it was continuity. This created uneven advances that unsettled Allied leadership. Some units raced ahead while others stalled, creating gaps that looked dangerous on maps. Coordination between armies lagged behind movement, and flanks appeared exposed. From a traditional perspective, the situation looked reckless. From Patton's perspective, it was already dangerous the moment speed slowed. The German retreat reflected this imbalance. Units withdrew along congested roads under constant air attack, abandoning vehicles when fuel ran out, and destroying equipment they could not move. Artillery was left behind. Communications collapsed. Officers lost control as formations dissolved into columns of exhausted men focused on escape rather than mission. What had begun as a fighting withdrawal turned into flight. This was not accidental. Patton was not trying to encircle entire armies in a single decisive battle. He was forcing them to keep moving until they stopped functioning as armies at all. Once cohesion vanished, destruction became unnecessary. German formations that reached the Seine were no longer capable of coordinated operations, regardless of how many men remained on paper. Allied headquarters began to grasp the scale of what was happening. The speed of the advance exceeded every planning assumption. Maps became obsolete almost as soon as they were printed. Success created new problems faster than they could be solved, particularly in logistics. Ports were still limited, rail networks were damaged, and trucks bore the entire burden of supply. The strain on the system grew daily. Criticism followed. Some argued that Patton was gambling on German weakness rather than securing Allied gains. Others warned that overextension would invite disaster if the enemy recovered faster than expected. Patton understood those risks. He simply judged them preferable to the alternative. In his view, slowing down would have been the real gamble. A pause would give German command the one thing it needed most: time. Time to rebuild structure, reposition reserves, and impose rhythm on the battlefield again. As long as Third Army kept moving, the enemy remained trapped in reaction. Momentum was not recklessness. It was denial. What made this phase decisive was consistency. The Third Army did not surge and then halt. It surged repeatedly. Each burst of movement compounded the last, keeping German forces off balance and stripping them of any chance to stabilize. Even temporary pauses were used to reposition for the next push, rather than to consolidate defensively. By the time supply limits and geography began to impose real constraints, the strategic situation had already changed. The German army in France no longer possessed the ability to conduct coordinated operations. Initiative belonged to the Allies, and it would not be surrendered again. Speed had done more than carry Patton forward. It had broken the enemy's system without needing to destroy it outright. That distinction mattered, because it explained why the advance could continue even when resistance hardened and terrain worsened. The question now was no longer whether speed could shatter an enemy. That had been proven. The question was how speed behaved once the easy ground ended and friction returned, a test that would force Patton to adapt his method yet again as the war entered its most dangerous phase. By mid-August 1944, the Third Army had advanced so far and so fast that the battlefield began to reshape itself again. The enemy was no longer collapsing simply because pressure was applied everywhere at once. Now the danger came from success itself. Speed had carried Patton deep into France, but that same speed was consuming resources faster than any plan had predicted. Fuel became the limiting factor almost overnight. Every vehicle that made the Third Army lethal depended on gasoline, from tanks and trucks to artillery tractors and ambulances. As the advance stretched eastward, supply lines extended hundreds of kilometers back to the Normandy beaches. Each mile gained increased demand, while reducing flexibility. The battlefield Patton faced was no longer defined by German positions alone. It was defined by roads, intersections, and how fast fuel could reach the front. France's road network turned into the real terrain of the campaign. Junctions mattered more than towns, bridges mattered more than high ground, and traffic control became a combat function. A single stalled convoy could freeze an entire division in place. A delayed fuel shipment could stop an armored thrust more effectively than enemy fire. Patton recognized this immediately and treated logistics as maneuver rather than support. Movement priorities changed constantly. Fuel was no longer distributed evenly. It was concentrated. Units designated to keep advancing received everything they needed, while others were slowed or halted entirely. This created internal tension, but it preserved the ability to maintain pressure somewhere. Patton accepted imbalance because balance without motion meant failure. This approach unsettled Allied command. On maps, the Third Army's front looked irregular and even dangerous. Some formations surged forward while others lagged far behind. Gaps opened between neighboring armies, and the risk of German counterattacks into exposed flanks increased. From a traditional planning perspective, the situation looked unstable. From Patton's perspective, it had been unstable the moment speed slowed. German forces sensed the shift. Retreating units were no longer disintegrating at the same rate. As they fell back toward shorter supply lines and more defensible terrain, fragments of cohesion returned. Rivers, towns, and road choke points began to matter again. Small delaying actions grew more frequent, not to win battles, but to buy time and let friction do its work. Patton responded by pushing harder. Instead of slowing to consolidate, he tried to outrun the closing window. Rivers were crossed before defenses fully formed. Towns were bypassed or encircled whenever possible. German units that attempted to stand were struck from unexpected directions. The objective was no longer simply to advance, but to prevent the enemy from regaining rhythm. This phase pushed the Third Army to the edge of its limits. Fuel convoys ran day and night. Drivers slept in their seats. Maintenance crews worked until equipment failed faster than it could be repaired. Some armored units sat motionless for days, engines cold, waiting for fuel that might never arrive, while others covered hundreds of kilometers in a single burst of movement. The army stretched across space rather than deploying along a front. German commanders recognized the opportunity this created. They did not need to stop Patton everywhere. Slowing him in key places would allow logistics and exhaustion to do the rest. Defensive efforts focused on bridges, roadblocks, and narrow corridors where delay mattered more than destruction. Time, once denied to Germany, became the resource they fought hardest to recover. Allied leadership faced a difficult calculation. Fuel was finite. Every gallon sent to the Third Army meant one less gallon available elsewhere. British and American advances now competed directly for supply, and political considerations began shaping operational decisions. Patton's momentum no longer depended solely on battlefield success. It depended on choices made far behind the front. Despite these constraints, the advance continued in uneven surges. Where fuel arrived, Patton moved. Where it did not, units paused reluctantly. This start-and-stop rhythm created new vulnerabilities, and German forces exploited pauses to reinforce positions along rivers and urban centers. The battlefield began to regain structure, not because Germany was winning, but because friction was returning. Critics later pointed to this phase as proof that Patton had advanced too far, too fast. Supporters argued that slowing earlier would have been worse, allowing the enemy time to stabilize. Both views captured part of the truth. What mattered was that the campaign had reached the edge of what speed alone could accomplish. The German army facing the Third Army at this stage was not stronger than before. It was weaker, poorer, and less mobile, stripped of equipment and confidence during the retreat across France. The reason natural barriers mattered now was precisely because speed had mattered earlier. Germany no longer possessed the depth to absorb setbacks. What remained were thin lines clinging to geography. Patton understood this and adjusted. Speed was no longer applied everywhere at once. It became selective. Heavy pressure fixed German forces where resistance was strongest, while exploitation continued wherever seams appeared. The campaign turned into a mosaic of stalled fights and sudden breakthroughs, each feeding into the next. The danger now came from friction rather than firepower. Roads clogged, vehicles wore out, men exhausted, and command coordination grew more difficult by the day. Even Patton recognized that physics imposed limits no willpower could override. Momentum could be preserved psychologically, but not always physically. Still, the effects of earlier speed remained decisive. German forces were delaying, not recovering. Every stand cost them more than it gained. Rivers slowed the advance, but did not reverse it. The operational depth Patton had seized could not be reclaimed. The question moving forward was no longer whether speed could break an enemy system. That had already been proven. The question was how Patton would adapt when movement slowed, obstacles hardened, and the war demanded endurance instead of acceleration, a test that would soon arrive in the most unforgiving form possible. The moment rivers replaced open roads, the character of the war shifted again. Momentum did not disappear, but it lost its freedom. By late August and early September 1944, the Third Army had pushed far enough east that geography began enforcing rules speed could no longer ignore. Rivers imposed pauses, demanded coordination, and punished impatience. What had been a pursuit now risked becoming a series of costly frontal fights. This was the danger Patton understood immediately. Rivers do not behave like towns or roadblocks. They cannot be bypassed casually or ignored without consequence. They force armies to slow down, concentrate forces, and expose themselves during crossings. For German commanders trying to recover control, this offered something they had not enjoyed since Normandy: a chance to reintroduce structure. The Moselle became the first major test. German forces fell back behind the river quickly, not because it offered victory, but because it offered time. Bridges were destroyed, approaches were covered by artillery, and defenders used high ground and urban cover to maximize the river's defensive value. Unlike earlier phases of the campaign, German resistance now had a shape. That alone mattered. Patton did not wait for textbook solutions. Instead of pausing to assemble overwhelming force at a single crossing point, he ordered probing attacks everywhere. Infantry units searched for undefended fords, damaged bridges, and weakly held sectors, crossing wherever even temporary footholds could be gained. Armor and artillery followed as soon as a crossing existed, often under fire and without full preparation. This approach carried obvious risks. Some crossings succeeded quickly, catching German defenders off balance and expanding before counterattacks could form. Others stalled under heavy fire, turning into grinding fights that consumed men and time. Progress became uneven. Units on one axis surged ahead, while neighboring formations remained pinned. To Allied planners, this looked disorganized. To Patton, it was acceptable friction. He believed that even partial success denied the enemy certainty. A single bridgehead forced German commanders to react, pulling reserves toward threats that might expand at any moment. Waiting for perfect coordination would give the enemy exactly what he needed: predictability. German commanders now faced a dilemma they could not resolve cleanly. Holding a river line demanded concentration, but concentration made units vulnerable to penetration elsewhere. Spreading forces to cover multiple crossings weakened their ability to counterattack. Every choice created exposure. Patton exploited this relentlessly, never allowing the enemy to feel secure along the line. Still, this phase revealed limits speed could not erase. German artillery was effective. Urban terrain amplified defensive strength. Casualties rose. Momentum slowed. The Third Army could no longer simply outrun resistance. The battlefield demanded endurance, engineering, and sustained pressure rather than rapid exploitation. Fuel shortages made everything harder. River crossings consumed enormous resources, including bridging equipment, ammunition, and fuel for concentrated operations. Supply constraints now dictated not just how fast Patton could advance, but where. Entire corps paused while others pressed on. Decisions grew sharper, and trade-offs more painful. Critics later pointed to this phase as proof that Patton's earlier advance had overreached. They argued that speed had created logistical imbalance and exposed the army to unnecessary risk. There was truth in that view, but it missed a deeper reality. The German army defending the rivers was not strong because it had recovered. It was strong because it was anchored. The enemy facing the Third Army at the Moselle was smaller, less mobile, and poorly supplied compared to the force that had retreated from Normandy. What remained were thin defenses clinging to geography because operational depth was gone. Rivers mattered now precisely because speed had mattered earlier. Patton recognized this and adjusted without abandoning his core principle. Speed stopped being purely linear and became selective. Where resistance was strongest, pressure fixed German forces in place. Where it weakened, exploitation resumed immediately. The campaign fractured into a patchwork of slow fights and sudden advances, each shaping the next. This required a different kind of discipline. Instead of demanding constant movement everywhere, Patton emphasized relentless probing. Quiet sectors were tested repeatedly. Pauses were temporary. Even when major offensives stalled, smaller actions continued, denying the enemy rest or certainty. The Germans were never allowed to settle fully behind the river. The psychological effect was substantial. German commanders could not plan beyond the immediate moment. Reserves were shifted constantly, often arriving late or in insufficient strength. Defensive preparations were rushed. Even when positions held, they did so nervously, aware that another crossing attempt might succeed elsewhere without warning. For American soldiers, the change was brutal. The exhilaration of August gave way to the exhaustion of September. Casualties mounted. Rain and mud replaced dust and open roads. The war slowed, and morale was tested in a different way. Speed no longer shielded units from sustained combat. Yet the broader effect remained decisive. German forces were being pushed backward toward their borders under constant pressure. They were delaying, not rebuilding. Every river line consumed resources they could not replace. Each stand cost them more than it gained. The Third Army might slow, but it did not stop. Patton's method had not failed. It had evolved. Speed alone no longer decided outcomes, but the memory of speed shaped every engagement. German commanders knew that if they lost control even briefly, Patton's army would surge through again. That fear influenced every defensive choice they made. The rivers did not halt the Third Army. They imposed a tax. That tax was paid in time, fuel, and lives, but it did not change the direction of the campaign. The German army could slow the advance, but it could not restore initiative. That distinction mattered more than any single crossing. What lay ahead would test Patton's adaptability even further. Fortified cities, worsening weather, and political decisions about supply priority would constrain movement again. The enemy would soon attempt one final gamble to reclaim momentum entirely. Speed had carried the Third Army to the threshold of Germany. By September 1944, the Third Army collided with a kind of fighting Patton had spent months trying to avoid. The open roads were gone, the easy bypasses disappeared, and the enemy finally found ground that could not be rushed without paying heavily for it. Lorraine imposed itself on the campaign with rain, mud, concrete, and time, all working against momentum. This was not a sudden failure of speed. It was a collision with limits. Lorraine offered the German army something it had not enjoyed since Normandy: defensible terrain layered with rivers, fortified cities, and prepared positions designed to slow an attacker rather than defeat him outright. German commanders understood exactly what this meant. They no longer needed to restore initiative. They only needed to make the war expensive in time and blood. The Moselle and its tributaries fractured movement into narrow corridors. Rain turned fields into swamps and roads into traps. Air power, which had punished German movement during August, was grounded by weather just as resistance hardened. The battlefield stopped rewarding audacity and started rewarding endurance. For Patton, this was infuriating. The Third Army had been built to exploit collapse, not to batter fortifications. Yet Metz, the central anchor of the Lorraine defenses, could not simply be ignored. Leaving a fortified city intact along critical supply routes invited counterattacks into the rear and threatened the entire advance. Speed alone could not solve that problem. What followed was a kind of fighting Patton despised, but understood. Crossings that once relied on surprise now demanded engineers, artillery preparation, and sustained infantry assaults. German defenders used terrain expertly, Forcing American units into frontal engagements Patton would have bypassed earlier without hesitation. Progress slowed to miles per week, rather than dozens of miles per day, and casualties climbed accordingly. Observers looking only at maps concluded the Third Army had stalled. That conclusion missed what was actually happening. Lorraine was not stopping Patton's army. It was draining the enemy's last reserves of capability. German units defending the region were understrength, short of ammunition, and stretched thin. Yet they were forced to fight continuously because pressure never fully lifted anywhere along the front. Patton adapted without abandoning his core approach. Instead of seeking sweeping maneuvers, he applied constant pressure across a wide frontage. Every defensive position was probed. Every quiet sector was tested. Attacks were launched not always to break through immediately, but to force German units to remain engaged, consuming men, ammunition, and attention they could not replace. Metz became the symbol of this grind. The fortress complex resisted initial assaults, inflicting losses and stalling momentum. Rain worsened conditions, rivers swelled, and supply difficulties compounded frustration. For weeks, the battle seemed to go nowhere, and critics began openly questioning whether Patton's earlier advance had led directly into this deadlock. What they missed was the cumulative effect. Every German unit tied down at Metz was a unit unavailable elsewhere. Reserves were pulled in, repositioned, and worn down. Defensive coordination frayed under constant strain. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Relief formations arrived late and incomplete. The fortress that had been meant to anchor the defense became a liability. When Metz finally fell, it did not collapse in dramatic fashion. German defenders withdrew or surrendered as supply failed, and command coherence eroded. The victory lacked spectacle, but its implications were decisive. A major obstacle had been removed, and the German army had paid dearly for delaying the inevitable. Lorraine revealed something essential about Patton's method. Speed was never meant to replace all forms of war. It was meant to deny the enemy rest. Even when movement slowed, pressure continued. Even when breakthroughs were impossible, initiative was preserved. The enemy was never allowed the pause required to rebuild an operational rhythm. For the soldiers of the Third Army, this phase was brutal. The exhilaration of August gave way to exhaustion in September. Rain-soaked uniforms, mud-clogged vehicles, and fighting became intimate and costly. Morale was tested not by chaos, but by repetition. Yet the army endured because its purpose remained clear. Every mile gained here shortened the war elsewhere. By late autumn, the Third Army stood near the German frontier. The advance had slowed, but the enemy was spent. German forces along the West Wall were stretched thin, defending vast sectors with limited means. Logistics remained strained, weather worsened, and Allied leadership debated priorities across the front. Patton understood what was coming next. The enemy had not abandoned the idea of regaining initiative. German command was preparing a final gamble, a counteroffensive designed to shock the Allies and reverse momentum in one violent stroke. This would not be a defensive battle. It would be a test of adaptability under pressure. Lorraine had prepared the Third Army for that test. The same command culture that enabled speed had learned endurance. Units that once raced across France now fought patiently through mud and concrete. They learned how to function when momentum vanished and friction dominated. This hard-earned resilience would soon matter more than speed ever had. When the German counteroffensive erupted in winter, Patton's army would not need time to adjust. It had already learned how to fight when the war refused to move. And that lesson would soon be called upon under the harshest conditions imaginable. December 1944 did not arrive gradually. It arrived like a blow, German forces struck through the Ardennes with speed, secrecy, and violence, punching a deep bulge into the Allied front and shattering the assumption that the enemy no longer possessed offensive capability. Snow covered the forests, fog grounded aircraft, and thinly held American lines bent under pressure. For the first time since Normandy, structure collapsed again, but this time it collapsed on the Allied side. The enemy had taken the initiative back, briefly. Many Allied headquarters needed time to understand what was happening. Reports conflicted, communications lagged, and the scale of the attack was unclear in the opening days. Patton did not wait for clarity. The Third Army had lived inside uncertainty for months, and that experience shaped his response immediately. Where others saw confusion, Patton saw direction. The German attack created a new center of gravity, and it lay north, not east. Bastogne, a road hub surrounded by forest and snow, became the focal point of the crisis when American units there were encircled. Relief would require speed, coordination, and movement under conditions that punished all three. Patton moved before the situation fully stabilized. Within days, he ordered the Third Army to pivot north, a maneuver that required disengaging from ongoing operations, rerouting logistics, and realigning corps across icy roads in winter darkness. This was not a single turn of the map. It was an army changing direction while in contact, under weather conditions that magnified every mistake. Movement became an act of discipline. Units displaced at night under blackout conditions, engines struggling in the cold, roads clogged with traffic and snow. Fuel remained scarce, vehicles broke down constantly, and schedules slipped. None of that stopped the pivot. Orders emphasized intent over detail, and commanders acted with the same independence that had defined the summer advance. This was speed without freedom. Unlike August, there were no open roads or collapsing enemies. Every mile north was contested by terrain, weather, and exhaustion. Yet the Third Army moved because it had been conditioned to move whenever movement mattered. Lorraine had taught endurance. France had taught exploitation. The Ardennes demanded both at once. When Third Army units struck the southern shoulder of the German advance, the effect was immediate. German formations pushing west suddenly faced pressure on their flank. Supply routes were threatened, timetables collapsed, and coordination broke down. The same German weaknesses Patton had exploited earlier returned under far worse conditions. Rigid planning failed when the battlefield changed faster than orders could adapt. The relief of Bastogne became the symbol, but not the substance. What mattered was the operational shock. A German offensive built on speed and surprise lost momentum the moment it was forced to react. Once that momentum slowed, the offensive began to unravel under pressure from multiple directions. Weather cleared, air power returned, and the window closed. Patton's counterstroke did not require brilliance. It required habit. The Third Army did not need to invent a new way of fighting. It relied on the same principles that had carried it across France, now applied in winter. Movement mattered. Pressure mattered. Waiting was fatal. German forces, already short of fuel and reserves, could not recover from the loss of tempo. The counteroffensive stalled, then collapsed, leaving the enemy weaker than before and with no strategic depth remaining. What had been Germany's last attempt to regain initiative ended as its final expenditure of it. For Patton, the Ardennes validated everything that had come before. Sicily had taught him how to deny the enemy time. France had shown how collapse could be created through speed. Lorraine had forced endurance when speed failed. The winter pivot demanded all three qualities under the worst possible conditions. The Third Army passed that test. After the Ardennes, the war's direction no longer changed. German forces retreated again, this time without illusion. Rivers, fortifications, and winter slowed the Allies, but they could not reverse momentum. Initiative, once lost, did not return. The winter pivot was not Patton's most dramatic maneuver because of how fast it moved. It mattered because it proved that speed was not recklessness. It was flexibility under pressure. An army capable of turning itself in winter, under fire, without breaking, was not going to be outmaneuvered again. From that moment forward, the end of the war became a matter of distance and time, not uncertainty. The enemy had spent its final reserve of initiative. Patton had built an army that knew exactly how to take it away. After the Ardennes collapsed, the war in the West entered a phase that felt quieter on the surface, but was no less decisive underneath. German forces continued to fight, continued to inflict casualties, and continued to delay where they could. Yet the nature of their resistance had changed. They were no longer shaping events. They were responding to them. Patton recognized that shift immediately. The Third Army turned east again, hardened by months of extremes that had stripped away any illusion about how the war would end. Speed returned, but it carried a different character now. This was not the headlong rush of August. It was controlled pressure, applied relentlessly, without pauses long enough to give the enemy a foothold. German units along the West Wall tried to make one final stand. Concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, and prepared fields of fire offered defenses that looked formidable on maps and in intelligence summaries. Earlier in the war, such obstacles might have forced lengthy set-piece assaults. By early 1945, they no longer functioned as intended. The German army defending them lacked the depth, mobility, and coordination required to exploit static defenses. Patton did not waste time proving strength where it was strongest. Instead, pressure fixed German units in place, while Third Army formations searched constantly for seams. Where resistance thinned, armor and infantry flowed through. Where it hardened, forces were contained and isolated. The objective was not to batter every position into submission, but to keep the enemy stretched, reacting, and unable to reassemble into anything larger than local resistance. This pattern repeated itself across Western Germany. Fortified lines that had once promised delay collapsed when bypassed. Towns that could have turned into costly battles were isolated and reduced later. German commanders discovered that even when a position held tactically, it failed operationally because it could not influence events beyond its immediate surroundings. The Rhine represented the last natural barrier with real meaning. German planners hoped it might succeed where other rivers had failed, yet the conditions that had made rivers effective earlier no longer existed. German reserves were thin, fuel was scarce, and command structures were fragile. Crossings occurred rapidly, bridgeheads expanded before counterattacks could form, and attempts to restore cohesion fell apart under pressure. Once across the Rhine, resistance fragmented further. German units surrendered in growing numbers, while others fought briefly before withdrawing or dissolving entirely. Orders issued from higher headquarters no longer translated into coordinated action. The war had entered its terminal phase, where effort remained, but direction was gone. For Patton, this stage demanded restraint as much as aggression. Speed was still applied, but not blindly. Units advanced where resistance was weak and held where it was strong, always with the same intent: deny the enemy any chance to reorganize meaningfully. Even now, tempo mattered. The war would end sooner if German forces were never allowed to recover rhythm. This final advance revealed something often misunderstood about Patton. He was not driven by motion for its own sake. He used speed when it broke the enemy's system, and he moderated it when pressure alone achieved the same effect. The refusal to hesitate did not mean refusal to think. Every decision remained anchored to the same question, whether the enemy was being denied time. By early 1945, the answer was almost always yes. German resistance slowed the advance, but never altered its direction. Rivers, cities, and fortifications imposed cost, not reversal. The outcome had been decided months earlier, when the German army lost its ability to control tempo in France and never recovered it. As the Third Army pushed into central Germany and toward Czechoslovakia, the fighting became uneven and often grim, but it no longer carried strategic uncertainty. The enemy could delay, but not decide. That distinction defined the end. Patton's final advance was not about spectacle. It was about ensuring the war ended as quickly as possible by preventing any final consolidation of German strength. Pressure remained constant, movement continued wherever possible, and the enemy was denied even the illusion of recovery. The war was no longer being won in dramatic breakthroughs, it was being finished. And the army Patton had shaped through collapse, speed, endurance, and adaptation was uniquely suited to carry that task to its conclusion. By the time the war in Europe drew to a close, arguments about Patton had already hardened into familiar shapes. One version cast him as a reckless aggressor who happened to win. Another reduced him to a useful blunt instrument, effective but dangerous. Both explanations focused on personality, and both missed what the campaigns actually demonstrated. Patton's real impact was structural. He did not succeed because he moved faster than everyone else in isolation. He succeeded because he understood how modern armies break, and, more importantly, how they stop functioning as systems. From Sicily onward, his focus remained fixed on one target: the enemy's ability to organize time. In Sicily, German forces were not destroyed in place. They were forced to withdraw before defenses could settle, which meant losses accumulated without decisive battles ever occurring. In France, the German front did not collapse because it was overwhelmed by firepower. It collapsed because pressure arrived faster than command could process, turning decision-making into guesswork. In Lorraine, Patton learned how to maintain pressure when speed failed. In the Ardennes, he showed that flexibility under shock mattered as much as aggression. In Germany, he demonstrated what happens when an army never regains initiative. Each phase followed the same logic. Patton treated time as the currency that mattered most. Every pause was measured against what it offered the enemy. If waiting allowed German command to recover coherence, it was rejected. If risk denied the enemy time, it was accepted. This was not impulse. It was calculation under uncertainty, carried out repeatedly under changing conditions. That approach required a specific kind of army. The Third Army was not exceptional because it moved quickly. It was exceptional because it could function without perfect information. Officers were expected to act on intent rather than instruction. Units were trained to move independently, knowing coordination would follow movement, not precede it. Logistics existed to sustain pressure, not to create balance. Errors were tolerated if momentum survived. Hesitation was not. This culture did not emerge naturally. It was imposed, often forcefully, beginning in Sicily, and reinforced through every campaign that followed. That is why the Third Army could pivot in winter without breaking. That is why it endured Lorraine without losing cohesion. That is why it could resume rapid movement once opportunity returned. German commanders recognized this by the end of the war, even if they could not counter it. Post-war assessments repeatedly described the difficulty of responding to American operations that refused to settle into predictable patterns. Patton's forces did not wait for battles to be arranged. They created situations faster than German doctrine could resolve. By the time responses formed, they no longer applied. What often gets lost is that Patton's method was not universal. It depended on logistics, air superiority, and a tolerance for risk that not every situation could sustain. Patton understood this himself. He never believed speed replaced all other forms of warfare. He believed speed was decisive when the enemy's system was fragile. And he possessed an unusual ability to recognize those moments. That recognition mattered more than raw aggression. Patton's legacy is often reduced to spectacle, speeches, pistols, and profanity. Those elements were real, but they were surface traits. The deeper contribution was less dramatic and far more important. He forced the American army to confront a truth it initially resisted. Hesitation costs more lives than mistakes when the enemy is disorganized. After 1945, that lesson did not vanish. It shaped how armies thought about maneuver, command authority, and initiative long after Patton himself was gone. Concepts like mission command and operational tempo did not emerge because of one man, but Patton proved they could work at scale with American forces under real pressure. Sicily showed how failure could become adaptation. France showed how adaptation could become collapse. Lorraine showed how pressure could continue without speed. The Ardennes showed how flexibility preserved initiative under shock. Germany showed what happens when an army never recovers control of time. That sequence was not accidental. It was the product of a commander who understood war as a contest between systems rather than formations, and who acted on that understanding again and again, regardless of cost to his reputation. Patton did not win because he was louder, angrier, or more dramatic than his peers. He won because once the enemy lost control of time, everything else followed. That was what Patton actually proved. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe continued to kill, destroy, and consume lives, yet its outcome was no longer in question. German units still fought, sometimes fiercely, sometimes desperately, but they no longer shaped events beyond the next few hours. Strategy had given way to survival, and command had given way to reaction. Patton understood this condition immediately. As the Third Army pushed deeper into Germany and into Czechoslovakia, resistance fractured further with every mile. Some formations attempted organized defense, others surrendered without contact, and many simply dissolved as supply and communication failed. Orders still existed on paper, but execution lagged behind reality. The German army could still resist tactically, but it could no longer act operationally. This was not a sudden collapse. It was exhaustion. Armies rarely fail all at once. They fail when their systems stop connecting intent to action. By 1945, German command issued orders that units could not carry out, planned movements that fuel shortages made impossible, and relied on reserves that no longer existed. That breakdown had begun months earlier, when the front dissolved in France and never fully reformed. Patton's role in this endgame was restraint as much as aggression. Speed remained part of the equation, but it was applied selectively. Units advanced where resistance was weak and held where it was strong, always with the same intent: prevent any meaningful recovery. Even now, tempo mattered. Every day without German reorganization shortened the war. This final phase revealed something often misunderstood about Patton. He was not driven by motion alone. He used speed when it denied the enemy time, and he moderated it when pressure achieved the same result. The refusal to hesitate did not mean blindness to limits. It meant understanding when delay helped the enemy and acting before that delay could take effect. By early 1945, Germany no longer possessed the ability to recover time at any level. Rivers, cities, and fortifications slowed Allied movement, but they did not change its direction. Resistance imposed cost, not reversal. The war had already been decided when German command lost control of tempo and never regained it. This is where Patton's campaigns fit into the larger picture. The war was not won in Berlin. It was won when the German army lost the ability to impose rhythm on events. Once that happened, defeat became a matter of distance rather than possibility. Patton's operations mattered because they ensured that loss of control was permanent. He did not destroy every enemy unit in his path. He made recovery impossible. That distinction explains why the end came as it did. Not with a single decisive battle, but with steady pressure that allowed no pause, no regrouping, and no return to initiative. The enemy fought on, but only within shrinking margins. When the war finally ended, Patton's reputation remained complicated, and it always would. Personality, politics, and controversy followed him into history. Those details matter less than the system he exposed. Modern war does not reward perfection. It rewards speed applied at the right moment. It rewards pressure that denies recovery. Patton's legacy was not noise or spectacle. It was proof. Once an enemy loses control of time, the war is already over.